Hello, and welcome back to Mysteries and Obscurities. It's funny, we started with World War II, went back to World War I, jumped forward to the Vietnam War, jumped back again with the Cold War, and now we've jumped way back with the American Civil War. I don't know where to go after this. I'd like to cover the Revolutionary War if there's enough material, and I think there might be. Same thing with the Gulf War, but I don't think there's enough there. But this one is the last one for a while. December at the earliest. But instead of wasting time talking about the future, let's discuss right now. Although it only lasted for 4 years, they may be the most important 4 years in all of American history. I mean, the United States split in half and fought each other for nearly 5 years. That's a pretty big deal. Which is why we're here today. In these 4 years, plenty of weird things took place, whether they be paranormal activity, strange actions in war, notable individuals stepping up, or unconventional weapons being used. We have over 100 stories of the sort sorted in an iceberg chart, where the more known stories are at the top, and as we go further down, they become more obscure. We of course cover the Civil War, but we also cover what led up to it and its effects on our modern day society. But enough yapping, let's get right into it with Tier 1. I try to begin each one of these things with what started the actual war, and that trend continues today with the Battle of Fort Sumpter, the event that triggered the Civil War. After the capture of Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812, plans for a sea fort to be built on an artificial island near Charleston, South Carolina began, and soon after, Fort Sumpter was completed. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union, happening on December 20th, 1890, and one of the first actions of the new nation was to immediately seize Fort Sumpter. However, the Union had their own plans involving the fort. They moved a United States major named Robert Anderson and his unit from another local fort to Sumter, and this began a stalemate that lasted into 1961. President James Buchanan attempted to send in supply ships to the Union forces at Fort Sumpter, but was fired upon by Confederate batteries now set up along the shore. This resulted in the ships turning back, leaving the Union soldiers with no supplies. But, as we get into March of 1861, President Abraham Lincoln, hey, you know that guy, right? He once again attempted to get supply ships in, but this was the last straw from the newly founded Confederate Army. So on April 12, 1861, the first shots of the Civil War were fired. At 4:30 in the morning, Confederate artillery fired on the fort, resulting in a fireback from the Union forces. The fighting lasted for 36 hours, before Major Anderson surrendered the fort at 2:30 p.m. the following day. Anderson and his soldiers returned home to New York City, where they were given a hero's welcome. Meanwhile, the southern states saw this as the breaking point, because right after the incident at Sumter, 6 more southern states left the Union, and the Civil War was on. If you were to ask someone what the Civil War was fought over, the resounding answer should be slavery. But some people choose a shorter answer: states' rights. 2 words that define an entire argument of the Civil War. And it's not technically untrue. The southern states broke away from the North due to the fact they did not want to follow certain federal laws being implemented. And guess what one of these federal laws was? The abolishment of slavery. So if someone is arguing with you about the Civil War and they say it was fought over states' rights, just ask them the simple question: states' rights to do what? The states' rights argument is just one part of the whole rewritten narrative of the Civil War known as the Lost Cause, and several aspects of that pop up through the remainder of the first tier. This is the Confederate flag. It's not the one you're used to seeing, that would be this thing. But we're going to cover the full history of both flags, the mix-up, and the controversy behind the flying of them. So we can begin with this flag, modeled very closely off the United States' own flag. The American flag has 13 stripes for the original 13 colonies, while the Confederate flag has 3 stripes and 13 stars for the 13 states that left the Union. It started with 7, but updated as more states left. But this isn't the flag you think of when someone is talking about the Confederate flag, it's this one. So where does this thing come from? Well, this is the Confederate battle flag, which was made because of the aforementioned similarity to the American Union flag. Commanders of the Confederate Army were getting confused on the battlefield, mixing up Union forces and Confederate forces because their flags are so similar. So this thing was made. It was first flown by the Army of Northern Virginia on November 28, 1861, and would later be given to most Confederate armies, becoming the symbol of the Southern states. This flag has rightfully stirred up a lot of controversy in its use. It became a modern symbol of the South beginning in 1948, when a new political movement called Southern Dixiecrats began to fly it. The Dixiecrat movement was made to oppose the Civil Rights Act, which would grant voting rights to African Americans. A lot of American state flags, namely ones in the South, featured the Confederate design in them, and this is slowly being phased out of modern flags. Nowadays, you still find it, and the common claim is that it's being flown to support one's heritage. It's something to be proud of. But I am now speaking as a West Virginian, a state that was made to escape the Confederacy. Seeing that flag flying here blatantly goes against what our state was made for, and I've seen it in Ohio too. Alright, come on now, guys. And I've even heard people say they've seen it in Canada, which is a whole other problem. Where's the weirdest place you've seen a Confederate flag flying at? Let me know. If the flag wasn't controversial enough, we can now talk about another modern-day controversy surrounding the Civil War and its legacy: Confederate statues. There are 1,503 Confederate memorials across the country, and just over half of them are statues. Of course, these things have stirred up a lot of controversy, particularly surrounding the removal of said statues. So we're going to cover their history, the teardowns, and I may just deliver the official Tan-Man opinion surrounding Confederate statues. So to begin, a lot of these things were made after the Civil War, a lot longer after the Civil War. But immediately after the war, several statues dedicated to Robert E. Lee were elected. But most of the time, if something was made to memorialize a soldier, it was in a cemetery. The first major wave of public statues being built came with the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South, laws made to oppress newly freed African American citizens. Another wave of them popped up in the 1950s across the South, during the time of the Civil Rights Act, and these things weren't being made to memorialize Confederate soldiers, they were made to scare African Americans. Since the early 2000s and stretching further into today, the conversation around Confederate statues has been that of removal. Between 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 2009, only 2 statues were removed. In 2020, 94 were removed. So that's their history, their inception, and their teardown. So as I promised, it's time for the official Tan-Man statue opinion. So let's stop and think for a second. When you're building a statue of someone, why are you doing that? It's to memorialize someone, to keep someone in your memory in an honorable way. So should we honor Confederate soldiers? No. I do not believe there should be public statues of Confederate soldiers or generals. The common argument is that removing Confederate statues is removing history, and I disagree. The history of the Civil War should be taught, but not the pro-Southern hero fighting the treasonous North version of the Civil War, which to me is what statues represent. Plus, how much history can be taught by just simply looking at a statue? If you want to teach Civil War history, there are better, more informative ways to do so. Another point, you know about the Germans in World War II, right? But is there any statues of the angry mustached German Chancellor in Berlin? No, there's not. But we all know his name. Now apply that to Confederate statues. If every single one of them were to disappear tomorrow, we're not going to suddenly forget about them. I'm not the only person who believes this. A lot of people believe that Confederate statues should be torn down and replaced with the true symbol of American history, the Mothman. There is currently a petition to remove all Confederate statues and replace them with Mothman statues. And at the time of writing this script, it needs a whole 12 signatures to pass. But why stop at 5,000? Run that number up if you want to see it happen. It'll be the first link in the description. Once the dust settled on the Civil War, waves of historical revisionism began to pop up from the southern states, in an attempt to rewrite their stance in the Civil War. It became less of, we broke away to keep slavery, and more of, we broke away to fight the treacherous northern tyranny. The first person to use this term lost cause was Edward Pollard, when he wrote his book, The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War Confederates. This book is where the idea of states' rights began, in print at least. Once again, the Lost Cause became popular in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, and the building of Confederate statues, like we mentioned earlier, is a part of the Lost Cause, all in one big attempt to paint the South as these rebels against a tyrannical government. This man is William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the generals of the Union Army, and is the namesake for the Sherman tanks used during World War II, and is best well known for his March to the Sea. Let's set the stage. It's August of 1864, and under a year, the Civil War would be over, and this is one of the major steps into ending that war. General Sherman began a campaign to capture Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta was one of the major cities in the South, serving as the railroad headquarters as well as their head of production. Sherman attacked the city with about 100,000 soldiers and a wide flank that ended in a Confederate surrender on September 2nd, 1864. Now, Sherman split his army in half. One went west into Tennessee, while his half marched to Savannah, in a mass destabilization of the state, now known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman's plan was to completely cripple the state. Factories, rail lines, farms, whatever made Georgia vital to the Confederacy was destroyed. There were two goals of this. 1. Cripple the state, like we said, make it useless to any war effort. And 2. Make life for people living there miserable, hoping citizens of the state would call for an end to the Civil War. Now, during his march, there were several Confederate skirmishes against the Union forces, but none of them were successful. 650 dead Confederates versus 62 dead Union soldiers. After 3 weeks, Sherman made it to Savannah, marking his destination on December 21st, 1864. Sherman sent a letter to President Lincoln stating, "I present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to leave the Union. Over the next half a year, 10 states followed, forming the 11 Confederate States of America. And one of these 11 was Virginia, which looked like this at the time. But now it looks like this. So what happened? Well, we got West Virginia. Ever since the state of Virginia was created, there was a divide between the west and the east parts of the state. This was due to a difference in the section's economies, and the fact that the west part of the state felt underrepresented in the state's politics. This came to a head with the secession of Virginia from the Union. Of the 49 delegates from West Virginia, only 17 of them voted in favor of leaving, while 30 voted against it. This gave rise to the discussion of West Virginia's own secession back into the Union states. 1 month after Virginia left, a meeting was held in Wheeling, West Virginia. Discussions and votes were held over the next month, and about half of the state was for Virginia's secession, but just over half were against it. So, it was decided that the state should break away from Virginia to join back with the Union. Statehood was approved in December of 1862, on the condition that slavery would be phased out. Another vote on this was held, and it was passed. And on June 20th, 1863, West Virginia became the 35th state in the Union. By the time of the Fort Sumpter incident, both sides of the United States realized they were going to war, and the Union began to formulate their own ideas of how to win. And the first major strategy implemented was the Anaconda Plan. This called for a naval blockade beginning in Washington, D.C., stretching down around Florida and coming up through the Mississippi River, encircling the Confederate States so they could cut off any naval traffic to and from them. This included the main export of the South, cotton, and any imports from any other country. The plan was developed by Winfield Scott, a commander in the Union Army, who made the plan with hope the war would end with little to no bloodshed. So did it work? At first, Confederate ships were getting through, but as the plan continued, the Union strengthened their blockade. Getting stuff in and out of the South became next to impossible. But it did not outright end the Civil War, as we know. Even with the Confederates being surrounded, the war persisted. Nowadays, if you hear anything anti-Confederate, it's accompanied by this song.
Oh, way down south in the land of traitors.
That's all I'll play, but this song is called Union Dixie, and is a parody of an original song called Dixie. This was a song huge in the early days of the United States. It was first made in 1859, being made for the minstrel shows at the time, basically a traveling sideshow that was setting out to be as racist as possible. Even before the Civil War, this song became an anthem in the South, beginning a bad-mouthing of the Union, furthering the growing divide between the two sides of the country. As the Civil War came, versions of the song were implemented by both sides, each demonizing the other, and this is where the Union Dixie version comes from. A version of the song completely in favor of the Union war efforts, demonizing the Southern soldiers. The version you hear today was recorded by Tennessee Ernie Ford, who also did a studio recording of Dixie on the same album, playing both sides so he always comes out on top. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia is the easternmost town in the state and is little over an hour away from Washington, D.C. Because of this, a United States Army was built here, which stored weapons and had facilities there to build more. Because of this, it became a target for John Brown, an abolitionist. Brown was a very vocal man, calling out the abolitionist movement as inadequate. He was quoted as saying, "These men are all talk, what we need is action." In the months leading up to the attack, John Brown rented the Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland, where he began to form his attack plan. His hope was to capture Harper's Ferry, getting a message out to enslaved people, and having them meet in the town before arming the crowd and beginning a nationwide armed slave revolt. Before this, he spoke with Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and attempted to get them to join his cause. Douglass called it a suicide move, and Tubman didn't join because she was sick. But with about 3 months of planning and gathering his forces, the fateful day in October arrived. Brown and his army, 18 men in total, attacked the armory on October 16th. They captured it in just 4 hours, freeing the slaves there who joined their party. For the next 2 days, Brown and his men held the armory and defended it against the townspeople who had formed a militia. News of this rebellion spread through the entire country, but no one came to join Brown's fight. Who did come was Robert E. Lee, leading a platoon of 90 United States Marines. 8 hours later, the Marines breached the gate and captured John Brown and his raiding party. Brown was imprisoned and was put on trial 2 weeks later, but his court proceedings lasted for just 45 minutes, where he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out on December 2nd. The raid on Harper's Ferry was seen as a precursor to the Civil War, as the state seceded from the Union a little over a year later. At that time in the country, the North and the South hated each other, but hopes of a compromise on the slavery issue were on each other's minds. Harper's Ferry killed that. The divide fell between the two sides widened, and war was on the horizon. This entry refers to how long the Civil War lasted. It began on April 12, 1861 with the Battle of Fort Sumpter, and ended on April 9, 1865. A period of 4 years and 3 days. Yes, that's right. The thing that's so celebrated today lasted a grand total of 4 years. That is only 2.7% of total American history. To illustrate how short that is, I'm going to present a list of things that have lasted longer. Five Nights at Freddy's, the development of Yandere Simulator, The Annoying Orange, the wait for a new Shadow of Israfel episode, yes, I'm still waiting, the entirety of Lego Ninjago, the Doritos Locos Tacos, support for Payday 2, and support for GTA Online, 2B2T, there's a lot more history on that server too, the Lego Star Wars line, LimeWire, the Arrowverse, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the support for Fallout 76, Prohibition, Shameless, building time for the Hoover Dam. I mean, I can go on, and I will. The wait for a new Sly Cooper game, Webkins, Pop Tropica, Cool Math Games, Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine, the wait for Elder Scrolls 6, Jimmy Carter, RuPaul's Drag Race, Heinz Collared Ketchup, Teen Titans Go, Microsoft Zune, and finally, Barack Obama's presidency. This man is Thomas Jackson, but you might know him for his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. Today, he's referred to as one of the best Confederates or maybe even the best American generals across any conflict. Jackson first gained prominence at the First Battle of Bull Run, one of the first major conflicts of the Civil War. The Confederate Army was losing at first, until Jackson showed up with reinforcements. As Jackson led his own regiment, the general over the already existing soldiers, Bernard Elliott, shouted, "There's Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Let us rally behind the Virginians." This earned the Confederate general his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. He continued being a general for the next 2 years, but if you read the entry title, we're going to talk about his death. It was during the Battle of Chancellorsville, taking place on May 2nd, 1863. As the Confederate forces were getting ready for a second attack, Stonewall Jackson rode forward to greet them. It was nighttime, so the soldiers couldn't see who was coming, so they assumed it was a Union attack, firing into the crowd. Jackson was shot 3 times, but was still living. He was carried away to a nearby medical tent, where his arm had to be amputated. But after a week of supposed recovery, Stonewall Jackson died on May 10th due to a bad case of pneumonia. He was mourned and buried in Lexington, Kentucky. If a soldier is to be injured or killed in war, any remaining family is to be paid their pension, a rule first implemented with the Civil War. This was passed by the United States Congress and put into law on June 27, 1890. It states that any veteran that served in the Union Army for at least 90 days and was injured to the point of being unable to work was to be paid a pension. Like we said, this was passed in 1890, and in 2020, 130 years later, the last Civil War pension was sent out to Irene Triplett. Triplett was one of 5 children, being born to her father Mose Triplett in 1930. when he was 83 years old. Mose fought for both sides of the war, beginning with the Confederacy before defecting to the Union. Mose would pass away in 1938 at the age of 92, and his daughter Irene would pass away 82 years later at the age of 90, and at the time of her death, she was receiving a monthly payment of $73.13. We will also quickly mention Helen Viola Jackson, the last widow of a Civil War veteran. In 1936, at age 17, she married 93-year-old Civil War veteran James Bolin. This was during the Great Depression, and Jackson was helping the man with his chores. And since he had no other money to pay her, he offered to marry her, so that she could get his pension long after his death. She passed away in 2020, receiving that same monthly payment of $73.13. We think there's division in American politics today, and there is, but nothing like it was during the Civil War. We're not seeing a representative almost get beat to death on the floor of Congress, something that definitely happened in the Civil War times. This is Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts and one of the leading voices in the abolitionist movement at the time. We're currently in 1856, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act recently passed, and we'll do a quick summary of it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act made the Missouri Compromise null and void, which was a previous arrangement that banned slavery above the 3630 latitude line across America. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was also calling for the addition of 2 new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. At this time, if a state was being added to the Union, the major point of discussion was whether or not they would be a state that allowed slavery or a free state. Under the Missouri Compromise, both of them would be free states. But the Missouri Compromise is no more, so what happened? Well, both anti- and pro-slavery people moved to Kansas, attempting to sway the vote in their favor, leading to a series of battles known as Bleeding Kansas. But we're off track. Let's get back to a senator being beat to death. Sumner was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, giving a speech condemning the authors of the bill, verbally attacking both Stephen Douglas and Andrew Butler. Butler is our focus. Sumner is particularly brutal to him, calling him unfaithful. This upset Preston Brooks, the first cousin to Butler and a representative from South Carolina. So 2 days after Charles said what he said, Preston approached him at the Senate chamber before he began to beat on him with his cane, knocking him to the floor. The attack continued to the point that his cane broke against the senator. Some senators tried to break the fight up, but another representative from South Carolina named Lawrence Keitt held them at gunpoint, saying let it be. This sent ripples across the entire country. Across the North, Charles became a martyr, a representative to the brutality of the southern states. In the South, Preston Brooks became a hero, a symbol of standing up against the North. In the following days, he was sent hundreds of new canes in the mail. Red Dead Redemption fans, did you know the Pinkertons are a real organization? The Pinkerton Detective Agency was founded in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton. The group originally specialized in catching train robbers and providing rail security. They also served as Lincoln's personal bodyguards during the Civil War while running espionage missions against the Confederacy. Lincoln was an unpopular president. I mean, the country split in half because of his election. So the Pinkertons were given this important role. Alan Pinkerton put Kate Warren in charge of the president's protection, where she uncovered and foiled a conspiracy to kill Lincoln, the Baltimore plot, something coming up later. So the Pinkertons may have killed John Marston, but they saved one of our best presidents. On April 25th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's funeral processions were passing through New York City, and this photo was taken nearly 100 years later, and a man named Stephen Laurent was researching Lincoln when he came across this exact photo. And as he studied it, he noticed something familiar looking. He identified a house on the corner as one that belonged to Teddy Roosevelt's grandfather, and he noticed 2 young boys in the photo watching the procession, and Stephen wondered if it was Teddy and his brother. Sure enough, he was able to contact Teddy's wife and ask him about it, to which he did identify the 2 as Teddy and his brother Elliot. Among the Tug Fork River, bordering Kentucky and West Virginia, 2 families waged a battle that lasted for 30 years. On the Kentucky side lived the McCoys, led by Randolph McCoy, while the West Virginia side housed the Hatfields, led by William Anderson Hatfield, or what he's better known as, Devil Anns. Their hostilities began during the Civil War, as the Hatfields were with the Confederates while the McCoys were with the Union, and a member of the McCoy family named Asa Harmon was killed by the Hatfields. This began an upset between the two sides that festered for a while. But the second round of escalation comes 13 years later, when the two sides were arguing about ownership of a pig. Floyd Hatfield claimed it was his, but Randolph McCoy claimed it was his. And this matter was decided by the local town judge, Anderson Hatfield, who of course sided with the Hatfields. So now what's the story of two warring families without some romance? And that's exactly what came next, as Rosanna McCoy began to date Devil Lance's son, Johnson Hatfield. Johnson was arrested by a McCoy militia on bootlegging charges, and Roseanne, along with some other Hatfields, rode out, breaking them out after a brief fight. And get this, after this daring rescue, Johnson left Roseanne. The feud remained like this for the next few years. Just simple back and forth arguments and an occasional murder. Just the typical Kentucky activities. But these heated up to a new magnitude on New Year's of 1888, when the Hatfields surrounded a McCoy cabin and fired upon the sleeping family. The cabin was then set on fire, and the two sides fought through the night. A few days after the massacre, a Kentucky posse rode into West Virginia to track down Devil Lands. But none of the Hatfields would come quietly, so they were taken out. Eventually, Devil Lands and the remaining Hatfields surrendered. This, and the feud as a whole, was upsetting the governors of Kentucky and West Virginia, who threatened militia invasion should this issue continue. But with the arrest of the Hatfield posse, it was over. In the modern times, the Hatfields and McCoy remain a well-discussed point of history for the two states, with several historical sites dedicated to the family feud. And speaking of family feud, the Hatfields and McCoy taped an episode together in 1979, where the McCoys won. And of course, the feud between the Braithwaites and Grays in Red Dead Redemption 2 is based off the Hatfields and McCoys. On the night of April 15, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was killed in his assassination. But on this night, we could have had 3 presidents killed. There was a conspiracy to kill Lincoln, and another target in this conspiracy was Andrew Johnson, his vice president and future president. Secretary of State William Seward was also a target and was attacked but survived. And if this would have gone through, we would have triggered a 3-step secession plan, something that has never happened. Anyways, back to Johnson. He was at the Kirkwood Hotel in Washington, and his would-be assassin and friends of Wilkes Booth, George Azardot, booked a room there. However, George spent the night drinking and lost his nerve to kill him. Afterwards, he dropped his knife into a gutter and was spotted and reported, leading to his arrest and later execution. So there's 2, but who's the third? Ulysses Grant. Grant was invited to the Ford's Theater by Lincoln, but he declined to go. This is because Grant's wife and Lincoln's wife didn't get along, so Grant stayed home. He later called it the biggest regret of his life, as he felt he could have stopped Wilkes Booth. So what would have happened if Ulysses went? Would he have been killed too? What was the biggest killer of the Civil War? And no, it wasn't the war, it was disease. It's estimated that 620,000 Americans died during the Civil War, and of these Civil War deaths, only 1/3 of them were combat related. The other 2/3, or just over 400,000 people, were killed by disease. The biggest diseases spread between the armies was pneumonia, typhoid fever, dysentery, and malaria. The living quarters of soldiers were dirty, and the lack of sanitation, along with the close quarters, made the living situations of these soldiers a breeding ground for these diseases. Also, medical care has came a long way from what it was in the Civil War. And this time, germ theory was something laughed at, and not believed in at all. So any tools used in surgery were not cleaned. So someone gets shot, and then these grimy, nasty, unwashed hands would end up digging around in a soldier's wound, causing diseases such as gangrene. In fact, this is why James Garfield died. He was the 20th president, Abe Lincoln's the 16th, so this is 20 years after the Civil War. He was shot in July of 1881, and would have survived without medical care. But with the unsanitary conditions of his doctors, he developed gangrene and died 2 months after he was shot. Now go back 20 years and apply this to hundreds or thousands of soldiers. In the early days of April 1865, Abraham Lincoln walked into the East Room of the White House to see a small group, including his wife and bodyguard, huddled over a covered body. To which Lincoln asked what was going on, and a soldier revealed, the president. He was killed by an assassin. To which Lincoln jolted awake. It was a dream. Lincoln revealed this to his close friend Ward Lamon. and this was mere days before Lincoln was shot and killed for real. This story is brought forward by Lamont 20 years after the president was killed, and it's been questioned if it actually happened or if he made it up for attention. The Civil War, in terms of American deaths, has the highest body count. In total, the Vietnam War and both World Wars saw the deaths of 500,000 Americans. The Civil War alone saw 650,000 dead soldiers, 150,000 more than those previously mentioned wars combined. This stat is kinda cheating though. In every other war, it wasn't taking place on the American soil, and it involved the Americans fighting a foreign power, while the Civil War was Americans fighting Americans, leading to that elevated death toll. Let's travel back to 1861. Several of the United States have just broken away to form the Confederates, and Virginia was one of these states, which of course included West Virginia. We've discussed that people in West Virginia did not agree with the decision of Virginian secession. Try saying that 3 times fast. So there were Northern sympathizers, especially the further north you went into the state, and one of these more sympathetic cities was Grafton. 2 soldiers left from Grafton, headed for Prunttown, West Virginia to recruit soldiers for the Union Army. These soldiers were Daniel Wilson and the focus of the century, Thornsbury Bailey Brown. The 2 soldiers were headed back from the Virginian city when they encountered 3 Confederate soldiers. Thornsbury shot at one, and they returned fire, killing him, making him the first ever Union soldier to be killed in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln is infamously the first president to be assassinated, happening right after he was elected in 1865. But he could have died years before this in another assassination. Lincoln's election was controversial. I mean, half the country broke away because of him, and threats began to pop up against the newly elected president. The most serious one was the Baltimore plot. This was an alleged conspiracy to take place against Lincoln on his way to his inauguration. Previously, the Pinkertons had uncovered a plot to kill Lincoln in Baltimore, Maryland. It was speculated that the attackers would be in the crowd and would stab Lincoln as he passed by. It's not known how real this threat was, but it was taken seriously. Lincoln wore a disguise through the city, and once this was uncovered, he was mocked relentlessly for it. However, he made it through unscathed. The average age of a soldier in the Civil War was 26, and most of them fell within the range of 18 to 45. But there were outliers on both sides of the spectrum, and we cover a few throughout. With the first one falling on the other end, John Clem, the youngest soldier in the American Civil War. Clem was born in Ohio on August 13, 1851, and the Civil War would break out 12 years later, and he immediately wanted to serve with the Union Army. After several attempts at joining, he was eventually adopted by the 22nd Michigan Infantry, which gave him the task of being a drummer boy. War is loud, like incredibly loud to the point soldiers could not hear commands from their officers. This gave rise to drummer boys, who were able to give commands by beating on massive drums, and different beats meant different commands. This is what John Clem did. There's a lot of myths surrounding Clem, claiming he was close to death several times while serving, but what is known is that in October of 1863, Clem was captured by Confederate forces while in Georgia. He was used for propaganda purposes in the South, highlighting the fact that the Union were sending literal children to fight their war. He was eventually set free in a prisoner exchange and would be honorably discharged in September of 1864. Clem continued service in the Army once he reached a more appropriate age, before passing away at age 85 in May of 1937. In 1856, New Orleans resident John Alexander Lamont began development on a new sidearm, the Lamont revolver, or Lamat. Anyways, the manufacturing was supported by future General P.G.T. Beauregard. At first, these things were being made for the United States Army, but with the Civil War breaking out, Lamont instead built them for the new Confederate Army. These things were to be built in England and shipped through Bermuda to avoid the naval blockade, making them pretty difficult to obtain. Nonetheless, about 1,000 of them made it to the Confederate forces, and a handful of Confederate generals used them throughout the war. But why are we rambling about some random revolver? What's the big deal with this thing? Red Dead Redemption fans, you're not allowed to answer this one. The Lamont holds 10 shots, 9 regular revolver bullets, and 1 shotgun shell. The gun is able to switch between regular revolver shots and a shotgun shell with the flip of a lever. Beauregard's own personal Lamont revolver is on display at the Confederacy Museum in Virginia. There is a debate on how skillful of a general Ulysses Grant is. Some people believe he was God's gift to the North, but other statements call him a singular word, butcher. The commonly agreed upon number is 360,000 dead Union to 258,000 dead Confederate forces, about half of the Union. So it's thought Grant was winning his battles more by attrition, sending in hordes of Union soldiers knowing he had plenty more to replace them, pretty much an unlimited supply, and the Confederates had more limited numbers. This is a theory, and Grant himself never stated this opinion, the opinion of throwing soldiers at his enemy until there were no enemies. Grant did recognize the numbers game, realizing he had more soldiers than the Confederates, but wasn't willing to throw away these extra lives. The big battle that's looked at is the Overland Campaign, where Grant lost 7,000 men in just one day, sparking controversy from other Union officials. But Grant himself was most critical, later expressing regret of certain commands in this battle, proving he wasn't just throwing men into a meat grinder, he felt remorse for his higher losses. Once the dust settled on the Battle of Shiloh, medics coming out to the battlefield noticed something strange. It was late at night, but across the battlefield set thousands of blue lights. As the medics got closer, they found where the lights were coming from. They were in the wounds of soldiers scattered across the fields. Bright blue lights were illuminating the wounds of the fallen soldiers. It's also reported that surviving soldiers, if they had these glowing wounds, they were more likely to survive. Being it was the Civil War, this was just kind of ignored and was nicknamed the Angel's Glow. But in 2001, a high school student named Bill Martin was visiting the Shiloh battlefield when he heard the legends, and his mom was with him. And his mom happened to be a microbiologist, and as she heard about the story of the Angel's Glow, she said something like, "Hey, that sounds like Photostophus luminescens, a microbacteria that glows a pale blue." So Bill and his friends investigated this, and came to the conclusion that the P luminescents couldn't survive in a human body due to their temperature. But they also had a counter, claiming that if you were to lay in a cold, bloody, wet, awful, nasty, muddy battlefield, you're gonna have your body temperature lowered, giving the bacteria a place to thrive. Alright, we're backing up to the lost cause discussion. We mentioned it earlier, and how the statues were being built as a part of this. This was a huge movement in the 50s and 60s, but these concepts were long rooted in the Southern identity. In the 1890s and stretching into the early 1900s, a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy worked together to spread the rewritten ideals and actions of the Southern states. The group was founded on September 10, 1894, in Nashville, Tennessee, and their stated motto was to tell the glorious tale of the fight against the greatest odds the nation ever faced. The group consisted of female descendants of Confederate soldiers, and they are responsible in part for the lost cause spreading so far across the South. They were also raising money to construct Confederate statues and memorials across the southern states, which is where a lot of them have came from. The group is still active today and is very much against the removal of statues, but they have renounced white supremacy, so I guess we are getting somewhere. On May 29, 1856, Abraham Lincoln was in Bloomington, Illinois, when he began to deliver a speech on slavery, condemning the practice. But really, he could have been talking about anything, because all records of this speech have been lost. Once Lincoln began giving the speech, reporters and townfolk alike stopped taking notes on it and instead listened. Because of this, we have no idea what the speech consisted of exactly. There are no transcripts of it available, only a brief summary that was posted in the local papers. In the review of the performance of the presidents, one area often discussed is Lincoln. He's pretty much always in the top 5 of people's list, for the simple fact of the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. So there should be no doubt that this was an objective good. But there's a common point made that Lincoln's intentions and goals in passing the 13th were less than noble. Let's talk about it. While Lincoln was against slavery his entire life, he did not view African Americans and whites as equals. At a dinner party in the White House in 1862, Lincoln gave a speech stating the African American race suffered greatly by living among us, while ours suffers from your presence. Lincoln also said the increase of half-breeds would threaten the very notion of white supremacy. He also was willing to extend or keep slavery entirely if it meant ending the Civil War early. His main goal was to preserve the Union. He even proposed sending freed African Americans back to Liberia to prevent them from growing up in a racist society. But not because he felt bad, because he didn't want to live with another race. And all of this leads into the idea that Lincoln abolished slavery to end the war faster. As we mentioned earlier, the majority of deaths in the Civil War were caused by disease, not warfare, and Richard Gatling noticed this. And he wanted to fix this. Gatling made his mark in history by creating the Gatling gun, a hand-cranked machine gun. A working prototype was made in 1861, and mass production began soon after, but was hampered by a factory fire. The gun saw next to no use in the Civil War, but his goal was to end the war with it. He thought he could make a weapon so violent either side would be scared to use it, causing an end to the war and every war afterwards. And he succeeded. Since the end of the Civil War, no other wars have broken out. As the Bowie knife swept across the nation, another massive knife was made to compete, the Arkansas toothpick. And here's the kicker. The Arkansas toothpick was made by James Black, the guy who made the Bowie knife popular. Now, Jim Bowie was the creator of the Bowie knife, and it became popular after he defended himself with it from 3 assassins. After he passed away, Black made replicas of this knife and sold them to people headed for Texas saying, "You need a Jim Bowie knife." Black also made the Arkansas toothpick, a knife made more for slashing, while the Bowie was made for stabbing. Both sides of the Civil War used this knife, and the name comes from European journalists. They would write about their times on the American frontier, claiming men would use these things as actual toothpicks, poking around their mouth with this big thing, painting Americans as barbarians, which we are. Each year, over 1.5 million people visit the Gettysburg battlefield located in Pennsylvania. This, of course, is the site of the infamous Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. In just under 3 days, 6,000 soldiers across both sides would be dead. So combine that mass tourism into an area full of death, and you get this entry. Because a lot of tourists in the Gettysburg area claim to see the ghosts of Civil War soldiers patrolling the grounds. Several infamous areas involved in the battle are claimed to be the most haunted, and several repeated occurrences have been observed. A lot of people have claimed to hear the drumline of an unseen unit, still believing to be at war. Others have claimed to see a lady in a long, flowing white dress, maybe looking for the love of her life buried somewhere in the field. And if you go on YouTube or any social media website and look for Gettysburg ghosts, you'll find countless blurry videos all alleging to have caught paranormal activity at the battlefield. If you were to guess when submarines were first used in battle, you would probably say World War I, and this is kind of right. But World War I saw more of a widespread modern usage of submarines, and they date back to 1600, holy shit! And the Revolutionary War. The first one to enter the official American Navy was the USS Alligator, being completed in 1862, 1 year into the Civil War. It was thought the submarine could be used to help take over Charleston, South Carolina, so it was towed to Port Royal, but on the way there, a massive storm hit the submarine and its tower, causing the submarine to detach and sink. Despite recovery attempts, it was never found. This isn't the only submarine being used in the war, and we'll have more stories as we go further down. This man is John Sedgwick, a Union general. During the Battle of the Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 9, 1861, his unit was ahead of the advancing Confederate forces, looking for a spot to ambush them, but were soon pinned down by snipers, causing his soldiers to dive for cover. They wouldn't poke their heads up, much to Sedgwick's confusion. To inspire confidence, he rose and walked between the lines beginning a speech. What? Men dodging this way for single bullets? Why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance. Mere milliseconds after finishing the sentence, he was shot in the face, dying soon after. Once the war was over and the Union reunified, it shouldn't be a surprise to learn that not all Southerners were ready to play ball with the new laws of the Union. To the point, they left the country. Even before the Civil War was over, the Confederates were sending travel envoys and representatives to different countries seeing if anywhere was more viable to move should the war not end in their favor. That was a long fucking sentence. One nation that was really inviting to the Southerners was Brazil. The nation was being led by Dom Pedro II, who knew how much cotton the South was growing, and he had hoped Brazil could be the world's producer post-Civil War. So between 1865 and 66, over 20,000 Confederates moved to mostly Sao Paulo, forming their own town of Americana. Today, Confederate culture remains huge in that region, where descendants of the original Confederates, now calling themselves Confederados, holds a festival at the end of April. This entails the cooking of American Southern food and the dressing in replica army outfits. Before Lincoln was shot, he had several failed attempts on his life. We discussed the Baltimore plot earlier, but this was just a conspiracy. Lincoln had an actual attempt on his life that almost killed him years earlier. In August of 1864, Abraham Lincoln was riding a horse to the White House when a shot rang out, passing through his hat, missing his head by inches. Lincoln's guards heard the shot and came running to the president, to which he rode up on his horse unharmed, but he was missing his hat. Men in this country used to have style, and I only need one name to prove that. This Giga Chad is Ambrose Burnside, a general for the Union Army, but that's not why you're looking at him. I see them, you see them, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. This guy's crazy facial hair. While not inventing the actual style, the word sideburns was taken from Ambrose Burnside, because he made this style popular. People saw this absolute hunk of a man and replicated this style, and it kind of remains popular today. Can you call it popular if only one celebrity is practicing it? So I know, I mentioned earlier I don't support public Confederate memorials, but there's one I think we can let slide, just one. I'll give you a second to blink and reevaluate what you're looking at. Yes, it's a grave for a camel the Confederates used during the Civil War. At this time, camels were being imported to the Americas for agricultural work, and Jefferson Davis wanted to use them opposed to horses. Horses across the army were dying to dehydration, a problem that would not be found in camels. So a domesticated camel named Old Douglas was given to the 43rd Mississippi Infantry, who in turn became known as the Camel Regiment. So how did the Confederate camel experiment go? Well, Douglas did stay close to his handlers, never wandering far, but he wouldn't last very long in a military setting. During its first conflict, the Siege of Vicksburg, a Union sharpshooter took the camel out. Which, first of all, how much anger do you have to have in your heart to shoot a camel? I don't know, but this anger spilled over to the Mississippi Regiment as they attacked the sniper, avenging their camel. Then they ate his body. In February of 1864, a 16.5-acre property in southern Georgia, about 2 hours away from Atlanta, was converted into a prison camp for Union soldiers. It was active for the rest of the war, and this place was awful. It was overcrowded. It was made to hold 10,000 prisoners, and at peak capacity, held over 33,000. Because of this, the Confederate supervisors did not have enough food, water, housing, clothing, whatever a human needed, there wasn't enough of it. Malnutrition and dehydration was affecting practically every soldier. The prison was enclosed by a wooden wall, and soldiers who dared to get too close to it were executed with no remorse. All in all, 13,000 soldiers died at Andersonville, and it was liberated in 1865. The liberators described the survivors as human skeletons. Once the war was over, the commander and overseer of Andersonville, Henry Wars, was tried as a war criminal and was executed as a result. We have came a long way in terms of the medical field. We mentioned earlier how disease was the biggest killer of the Civil War, and a lot of these deaths could have been prevented, but procedures have also improved and have become a lot safer, and one of these most important inventions was anesthesia. But before anesthesia was invented, the name of the game in surgery was speed. You wanted the procedure to be done as quickly as possible to limit the pain of your patient, and there was no man faster than Dr. Robert Liston. Liston gained a reputation for his speed, and would even attract crowds to watch him work, but his reputation was tainted because of this fact. In 1847, which first of all is 20 years before the Civil War, which disappointed me. I thought this story took place during the Civil War, hence why it's on this iceberg, but anyways, in 1847, Robert is called in to do what he does, perform an amputation. But that amputation would end in the deaths of 3 people. So how did the removal of one person's limb cause the deaths of 3 people? Well, first of all, Robert is going as fast as he can, and he accidentally sliced the fingers of his assistant. who would later die of gangrene. He also sliced through the coat of a spectator, who thought he himself was cut, so he died of shock. And finally, the patient he was working on died from gangrene, giving him the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. There are two stories brought up when people hear the name Dan Sickles, and we'll cover both of them. So Sickles is going to come out of the gate swinging, when on February 27, 1859, he shot and killed Philip Barton Key, the son of Francis Scott Key, the composer of the Star-Spangled Banner. Sickles did this after Barton was flirting with his wife, who was 16. On trial, he used the excuse of temporary insanity and was let go. Sickles then became a general in the Union Army, where he popped back up at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was given a forward march order, to which he obliged, but this turned out to be a disaster. 40% of his soldiers were killed, and he himself lost his leg from a cannonball, so his time in the war was over. But he wants his time to be remembered, so he donated his amputated leg to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Maryland. Through the rest of his life, he would visit the museum to pose with his leg, and is still on display today. Here's another controversy of Abraham Lincoln's presidency that brings him down in the eyes of historians, and this all deals with legal jargon, so bear with me because I am a little stupid. A right of habeas corpus basically applies to arrested people, that when you're arrested, you have a right to know why you were arrested. And during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended this right. The reason for Lincoln's decision of suspension, another tongue twister, Jesus, all has to do with the state of Maryland. Maryland is home to Washington, D.C., but was located in more slave territory. While it didn't secede from the Union, Lincoln was worried they would. To prevent spread of dissenters, Lincoln suspended the right on April 27, 1861, giving the military the power to arrest individuals deemed a threat to the United States Army. This lasted for the entire war, before being reinstated in 1867. Some people have lived lives that feel made up right off the pages of a screenplay, and this definitely remains true for the Civil War. And there are a few people like this throughout, and our first one here is Robert Smalls. Smalls was born into slavery in 1839. By the time the Civil War broke out, he was enslaved on a ship called the Planter, which was a transport ship about to be leased out to the Confederate Army, and Smalls was the pilot of said ship. But Smalls saw the Civil War as a chance to escape, and he was just handed his ticket. Smalls, his family, and 16 enslaved people passed through Charleston Harbor, where they encountered Confederate ships. But Smalls remained calm, donning a captain hat and using the proper signals for naval travel he had learned while his time as a pilot. Smalls made it through the blockade and handed the ship over to the U.S. Army. He served through the war, and even petitioned the current Secretary of War to begin recruiting black soldiers. And once this was agreed to, Smalls himself recruited 5,000. Once the war was over, he purchased the mansion he was once enslaved at, and now with the house and no war looming over him, Smalls went into business with a man named Richard Gleaves, where they opened a store for newly freed slaves. Finally, he had a stint in politics. He served in the House of Representatives for a collective 10 years across 3 different terms. Robert would pass away on February 23, 1915 at age 75. The Confederacy surrendered on April 9, 1865, but this did not mean the war was over. Confederate holdouts continued their fights across the country, but the final battle of the war began on May 12, a month after Lee surrendered. The battle took place in Cameron County, Texas, an area that was observing an unofficial truce. But a new colonel to the Union Army, Theodore Barrett, ordered an attack on a nearby Confederate camp. This was a strange move. First of all, he knew about the Confederate surrender. There was no reason to fight. And 2, he had never commanded an army before, and here he was trying to play war hero. The battle was a mess, and it ended in the deaths of 115 Union soldiers with no dead Confederates. This marked the last battle of the Civil War. The CSS Shenandoah was a British merchant ship purchased by the Confederate Army and turned into a destroyer. The ship's purpose was to disrupt naval trade the Union Army was taking place in across the world. The ship's final mission began on October of 1864, where they headed into the Pacific Ocean, targeting Union whaling ships. In total, over its 11 months of service, it sunk at least 38 Union ships, costing them $1.6 million in damages. So like we said, the ship was launched in October of 1864, and the war ended in April of 65. So for 5 months, the ship was still sailing around the Pacific, targeting and attacking Union ships. While making various stops, the crew heard rumors that the war was over, but it took them to officially read Jefferson Davis's arrest before they called it quits. The ship was originally headed for San Francisco for an attack when they encountered a British ship also headed for San Francisco, which is where they learned the war was over. So their Confederate flag was lowered and the crew surrendered, ending the Civil War for them. Did you know the death of President Abraham Lincoln created the funeral industry? Before Lincoln's death, funerals were a lot more simpler. You'd die, and your family would clean your body up, dress you in nice clothes, and if you were rich enough, a carpenter would make you a pine coffin. And that was it. During the Civil War, most of the people killed would simply be left there to rot. But the richer families paid to have their families' bodies preserved with this new technique, embalming. Embalmers were making so much money that fights broke out over dead bodies. The Civil War ended, Lincoln gets shot and embalmed, and then his body was paraded across the country. For many Americans, this was the first time they saw a preserved body, inspiring them to do the same for their family. Fast forward to today, most every person who dies is embalmed to have plenty of time for family members to pay their respects. Something not commonly discussed is how other nations reacted to the American Civil War. I'm sure a lot of people believe nations weren't so interconnected with news back then, but we were, to some degree. No nation recognized the Confederacy as a legitimate state. The British cut off their trades with the South, Mexico denied requests to help the South, even though independent agents did lend support, and the King of Siam offered to send President Abraham Lincoln war elephants. So first of all, Siam is modern-day Thailand, and their king, Rama IV, reached out to Lincoln with the benefits of using elephants for military and industrial use. But Lincoln politely declined, saying the American climate would not support elephants. This is lame. It's not like our modern times when you can look up a picture of an elephant. Back then, I'm sure a lot of Confederates had no idea what an elephant was. So now imagine they're about to fight a Union regiment, and they see these massive gray four-legged beasts stampeding towards them. Also, imagine the March to the Sea now being conducted on top of a war elephant. That's the alt history I want to see. Did you know the worst maritime disaster happened immediately after the Civil War? Worse than the Titanic, worse than another famous shipwreck, the Edmund Fitzgerald, sure. But it's likely you have never heard of this, because no one in that time heard about it. Because the disaster happened 2 weeks after Lincoln was assassinated, and news took a longer time to get around back then. So newspapers would be centered around the president's death, not this disaster. But now it's time we give the worst shipwreck in history its time in the sun. The ship in question was the Sultana, a steamboat built in 1863, with a new type of steam propulsion. Their boilers could produce twice as much steam as previous models, and had to be cleaned thoroughly because at any sign of clogging came risk of a pressure buildup, and then an explosion, which is what happened. After Andersonville, the Confederate prison, was liberated, a ship was needed to take these men back home, and the Sultana was chosen. So the ship docked in St. Louis and loaded up 1,900 Union POWs, while its capacity was right at 400. The ship left and began battling floodwaters up the Mississippi River. And at a stop, some weight was taken off the ship, but it was still way overloaded. At around 2 in the morning on April 27, 1865, a boiler exploded, followed by 2 more, killing a lot of people immediately. The ship was aflame, and the pilot was killed, so the Sultana became an undriven, flaming death trap floating down the Mississippi River. People jumped into the waters, where many died of hypothermia before coming ashore in Memphis, Tennessee. The ship sunk near Marion, Arkansas. Of the total 2,137 people above the Sultana, only 963 survived, a 45% survival rate. To put that in perspective, 1,500 people died on the Titanic. In 1885, an annual meeting of Sultana survivors came together, but by the mid-1920s, it was down to one man, Private Jordan Barr, the last survivor of the Sultana, who died on May 16, 1938. Due to a lack of a reliable supply chain of food for Civil War soldiers, both sides of the conflict usually hunted to keep their unit fed. Entire patches of wilderness were stripped away of all their wildlife, and if it moved, it was eaten. Most of the time, it was deer, rabbit, maybe a bear, a squirrel, typical North American wildlife. But occasionally, the Union would bag a pterodactyl. No, unfortunately, this picture is a fake. This photo was made for publicity for a show in the early 2000s called Freaky Links. That's it. I know, it's boring. I would much rather believe that the Confederates and Union soldiers took breaks from shooting each other to hunt dinosaurs. But sometimes fiction is cooler than fact. However, some people do swear this is a real picture. Namely this guy I've ran into named Matt Powell. Verena Davis was the wife of President Jefferson Davis, making her the first and only First Lady of the Confederate States of America. But even though she was in such a high position among the southern states, she did not support them. She lived in Richmond for the entire war, a war she knew the outcome of. She stated that the South did not have the materials or other qualities necessary to win this war. She also did not support their position on slavery. Once the war ended, the two fled further south, attempting to get on a boat to England, but were captured and arrested by federal troops. Once they were released, they spent less and less time together, before Jefferson died in 1890. She finished his autobiography and moved to New York City. It's here where she would be asked her stance on the Civil War, and she continued her constant opinion that the right side won. In her later life, she actually befriended Ulysses Grant's wife, but Verena would pass away in 1906, being buried next to her husband in Richmond. As the Civil War was coming to an end, and the South realized it wasn't ending in their favor, plans of continuing it in the future were discussed. And to keep this fight going, they needed some form of financial protection. So large swaths of gold were said to be hidden across the American South. The exact amount is not known, but we do know a lot was hidden. As the Union troops were about to invade New Orleans, millions of dollars of gold was moved to Columbus, Georgia, where PGT Beauregard, who you'll remember earlier made the Lamat revolver popular, then took the gold from the Bank of Columbus, where it disappeared. As the Confederate Army ceased operations, it said Jefferson Davis was fleeing the country with large amounts of gold and silver, carried across multiple wagons. However, he was said to have dropped the gold across the South, paying soldiers or leaving it in banks, or burying it or just hiding it anywhere he could in the South. When he was arrested, he did have a good bit on him left, but not nearly the amount that was reported. So where did this treasure go? Once Abraham Lincoln passed away, the contents he had on his body were locked away until February of 1976, which would have been the president's 167th birthday. Inside were several pairs of glasses, a pocket knife, and the focus of this entry, what he had in his wallet. He carried several newspaper scraps and Confederate money. A $5 bill, issued in 1864 by the Confederate government. It's not known why he had this thing on him, but the most common theory is that it was a souvenir, as just 2 weeks prior to his death, he visited the now destroyed city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, where he may have picked up this dollar bill. On one morning during the Civil War, a Union encampment was attacked by a Confederate one, much to their confusion. How were they able to sneak up on them? It made no sense, but actually it made perfect sense, because this Confederate unit was led by the Gray Ghost, John Singleton Mosby. Mosby preferred to move stealthily, because units when moving were typically loud, with their sabers clinging together, their canteens jiggling, and the sound of horses' hooves giving away units all the time. But not Mosby's. He ordered his unit to travel lightly as possible so they could always get the jump on their enemy. He was even captured by Union soldiers several times, but was always able to sneak away, giving him the nickname the Gray Ghost. Once the war was over, a Union bounty was placed on his head, but he received a pardon from Grant, who gave him a position in his cabinet. The Civil War got the conversation started around automatic weapons, or at least a gun that could fire more shots faster. We mentioned the Gatling gun earlier, but this new weapon is just a little bit smaller, and it finds its origins way before the Civil War. Ideas for a gun like this date back to even before the American Revolutionary War. But the first models were made in the early 1800s, with the first patent coming in 1814. But the most famous name associated with the harmonica guns, not just pistols, there were rifles too, was Jonathan Browning, who made the first widespread harmonica guns. The gun works much like any modern gun, as when the bullet fires, the slide moves, ready for another shot. It's not known how many of these things were used in the war, just that they were used on both sides. Across both sides of the conflict, soldiers and civilians alike began to complain about a strange illness. It consisted of blisters beginning at the hands of soldiers before spreading up their entire body, and it caused them to itch in any affected area. I had a bad case of the itch, so much that my hands were swollen and my fingers stood apart. Sores and yellow blisters came between them, and they ran corruption. These are the words of Private Milton Asbury Ryan, a soldier in the Confederate Army. The run corruption basically meant it was infected. Today, we're still not 100% sure what the army itch was exactly, but we believe it was some type of scabies spread through the unsanitary conditions of the Civil War soldiers. There were mild outbreaks of this in civilian life once the war was over, but nothing life-threatening, all just one big annoyance. During the American Civil War, a battle took place in Lewisburg, West Virginia, where a vastly outnumbered Union force defeated the Confederates. After that battle, Union General George Crook refused to hold burial ceremonies for the fallen Confederates. Now, Lewisburg was heavily sympathetic to the Confederate forces, so the citizens there defied orders and laid the Confederate soldiers to rest in a trench. Years later, they were dug up and moved to a proper cemetery. A cross-shaped mound marks the final resting place for these 95 dead unknown soldiers. The Civil War set many records. The best well-known one is the death count, but one never discussed is the fact that the largest ever snowball fight took place during one of the bloodiest American conflicts. On January 28, 1863, much of the American South was blanketed in over a foot of snow, so two divisions of the Confederate Army decided to have some fun with a snowball fight. Or it might be apt to call it a snowball war, because it was treated as such. Lines of Confederate soldiers built massive pyramids of snowballs to launch at their opposition, but these lines soon broke, and before it was all over, at least 9,000 Confederate soldiers were engaged in the snowball fight. It started off slow, maybe about 100 soldiers in total, before exploding into the aforementioned 9,000, making it the largest snowball fight in history. On April 12, 1861, the attack at Fort Sumpter began, causing the American Civil War to begin. 4 days after this, former President Franklin Pierce proposed the meeting of all living former presidents, including Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, himself, and James Buchanan. Do you know any of these names? Anyways, this meeting was to be held in Philadelphia to discuss an end to the Civil War. Since Van Buren was the oldest living president, Pierce asked him first, and asked him for help in setting up the meeting. However, Van Buren declined, stating that the latest president, James Buchanan, should be the one to lead the meeting, but agreed to attend if the others would. But Pierce talked to Buchanan, and he had no interest in making this meeting, and this caused it to all fall apart, as the former presidents began to back Lincoln more and more, much to Pierce's dismay, as he was a staunch supporter of the South. Did you know landmines find their origins in the Civil War? Well, widespread use that is, and it was mostly Confederate forces using them. This man is John MacGruber, the first Confederate general to use mines in the war. He had previously seen their use in a Russian conflict, so he applied it here at the Civil War. His forces were about to abandon Yorktown, Virginia, but before they left, they buried several crude explosives around the city streets. And once the Union occupied the town, they reported deaths from these devices. Since both sides were seeing widespread naval usage, ideas for sea mines also entered the battle plans. Since the Confederacy knew the Union had a superior navy, they revisited the nation's old plans of sea mines, deploying them in the water around their harbors and ports, and they managed to sink several Union ships doing so. How many cars crash in a day? How many planes crash in a year? The number is more than one, but one blimp crashes and no one gets them anymore. But the Hindenburg went down in 1937, and the Civil War ended in 1865, so hot air balloons were able to be used in the war. They were mostly used for reconnaissance reasons, giving soldiers the ability to view battlefields from the sky to help direct lines and artillery fire. From the sky, people in the balloon would send signals down using flags or a telegram. Balloons were tethered to the ground to give a safe landing, but during one incident, a general named Fritz Porter rose into the sky when his tether snapped, causing him to drift over Confederate lines, where he was fired at. He remained unharmed and drifted back to Union lines before landing safely. Once again, we're back to strange ways soldiers wanted to kill each other faster and in higher quantities. This thing looks like it's right out of some millennial steampunk world, but rest assured it was a real weapon used in the Civil War. Let's first discuss Samuel Colt, who was famous for his Colt revolvers. So attempts to carry over the success of that gun into a repeating rifle were made, giving birth to this monstrosity, the Porter Turret Rifle. It was patented in 1851 by Perry Porter, but he should have never attached his name to this walking misfire. Improperly constructed cylinder-based weapons often led to all cylinders firing at once. Samuel Colt knew this, and spread it far and wide, trying to limit the sales of the Porter rifle, considering they were in direct competition of his revolvers. Colt even lied and said Porter was killed by his own gun misfiring and exploding. A complete lie, but it worked, because only about 1,200 Porter rifles were made, and saw limited, yet some, use in the Civil War. Across both sides, espionage was running high, and we're going to cover the Red String, a group of spies active in the southern United States helping the Union. Even before the war started, the group was founded by John Polk, gathering southern dissenters to help the Union. The name Red String comes from the fact that some form of a red string was used for identification, whether it was tied to their clothes or hung from their windows. One of the main pillars of the Red Strings was decentralization. They didn't want to know each other and they wanted no formal organization, no large gatherings. The name of the game was to act as individuals. The Red Strings have a list of exploits, helping smuggle prisoners into the North, break people out of prison, and they gathered information about troop movements and numbers for Union soldiers. One of the most brutal, yet overlooked battles of the Civil War was the one that took place in Chickamauga. It was the second bloodiest battle in the Civil War, with over 4,000 people dying in 2 days. Once the battle was over, soldiers observed the battlefield, looking for their fallen comrades to bury. But reports from both sides described something strange. All the hate and malice in the area attracted some strange beast. It was white and hairless, a human-like beast with a mangled jaw and 2 large fangs sticking out from it. And of course, it had 2 bright green eyes. The beast was never captured and was nicknamed Old Green Eyes by both sides of the war. Old Green Eyes was reported to be seen after the Civil War as well. In 1981, Park Ranger Edward Tunley claimed to have seen Old Green Eyes. When it passed me, I could see the hair was long like a woman's. The eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were glaring, almost greenish-orange in color, flashing like some kind of wild animal, he said in his report. Nowadays, Old Green Eyes is a local legend, the story of a cryptid in that area that people now look for to no avail. In July of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln put out a call to arms for soldiers to join the Civil War effort, and Jenny Hodges wanted to join. But the Union wouldn't take females, so she had to disguise herself. So Jenny Hodges wouldn't enlist, but Albert Cashier would. And let's pause a second. Listen, I'm a trans ally. I think people should live the lives they want to live, so I'm all for that and everything. But you transition, and you gain a whole new identity, and you decide to name yourself Albert Cashier. Fucking Albert Cashier. But whatever, Albert's stupid name isn't important right now. Albert was revered through the entire war for his bravery, and once the war was over, Albert survived and went home and continued to live their life as a man. Cashier got a job with Senator Ira Lish, and like any crappy boss, the senator hit him with his car, causing him to be hospitalized. While in the hospital, a nurse discovered Albert's secret, but chose not to reveal it, same as Lish. But Albert would eventually get outed after he had to be moved into a psychiatric hospital, where he was forced to dress as a woman after 50 years of being a male. This is when the story leaked to the press, and Albert almost had his pension taken away due to this. But the remainder of Albert's unit showed up to his defense, saying this was not Jenny Hodges. This was Albert Cashier, a brave veteran of the Union Army and should be treated as such, and this saved Cashier's pension. He would pass away mere years later and was buried with full honors. Well, I fell into the mother of all rabbit holes with this entry, and it took me to websites that looked like they weren't updated since the Clinton administration. But here we are. I'll just lay out the conspiracy theory behind this entry. The Rothschilds killed Abraham Lincoln. The Rothschilds are at the forefront of any conspiracy theory. They are the richest family in the world and have been for almost 200 years. If there's something going wrong in the world, you best bet someone has blamed it on the Rothschilds. And it continues here. So we'll just dive right into the theory. It's thought the Rothschilds hired John Wilkes Booth to kill Lincoln as retaliation. The conspiracy alleges Lincoln was offered high-interest loans by the Rothschilds family to fund the Civil War, but he refused and funded the war domestically. Lincoln also had plans for the America's financial future. He already issued the first paper money in the country and was planning on getting agricultural production back up, bringing America closer to prosperity. But this theory alleges the Rothschilds were betting on an America that would take longer to bounce back. Although this leads to the idea they hired Booth to kill Lincoln. Alright, theory is out of the way, so let's begin dissecting it. First of all, this article claims this information came from something called New Solidarity, an article that was posted in October of 1976. No amount of research would give me access to it. Second of all, there was a book written about this very conspiracy theory by Xavier Hayes, and I read a review, and it said the book is filled with very basic mistakes. Like he states William Harrison died a year into his term, when he died a month into his term, and other things along these lines. And they list sources the book uses, and they list his sources. One comes from Business Insider, and one comes from conservativeheadlines.com. And finally, I can't find anything about this online. It's on two websites that have unidentifiable sources, and like I said, they haven't been updated in 30 years. All of this makes me skeptical to say the least. Once again, another weapon we believe is fully modernized is the rocket launcher, but different types of rocket artillery were used in the Civil War and even at times before this. The Americans saw them be used during the War of 1812, but once that was over, they didn't get used again until the Civil War, where both sides used them. The Confederates used a style of rockets called Congreves, which were insanely inaccurate, and the Union used hail rockets, which were kinda similar to the Congreves. However, the hails consisted of a metal tube that fired 7 and 10-inch long stabilized rockets up to 2,000 yards away, but neither of these things saw widespread use. One of the craziest facts about history that I love is that the Wright brothers airplane was flown in 1903, and the moon landing took place in 1969, 66 years later. If these events took place today, and the moon landing happened in 2024, then the Wright brothers' flight would have taken place in 1958. Ever since men first saw birds, we knew it wasn't fair. We were destined to take to the skies, and ever since we wanted to take to the skies, we wanted to weaponize our ability to take the skies. So what's all this yapping leading to? The fact that the Civil War was almost fought in airplanes. Everyone needs a hobby, and by day, Dr. Huntley was a dentist, and by night, he was a mad scientist, working on a steam-powered flying machine. Hunt wrote about his efforts to Jefferson Davis, including the schematics and other documentation. Davis referred Hunt to Robert E. Lee, who got him in touch with Jeremy Geimer, the chief of the Engineer Bureau for the Confederacy. Geimer appointed a board of engineers to review Hunt's idea, but the report came back with less than favorable results. Getting the machine in the sky was the problem. The current schematics could not answer the lift question, so they were put on hold and were never built. The first camera was made in 1816, so by the time the Civil War came along, they were widespread enough to where certain aspects of the war were captured in photographs. This included battlefields, downtime, and just portraits. However, some of these photos have more mysterious origins, and attempts have been made to identify the people inside for proper labeling, but a lot of the photos remain unidentified to this day, and there are ongoing searches to identify the people. And the one that's most sought after is this one. One of 2 female children. The photo was found between 2 Civil War bodies, one being Confederate and one being Union. There are no leads on who these people are, and it's likely it'll never be solved. One of the Confederates' most important and successful ships was the CSS Alabama, sinking several Union commerce ships across the North Atlantic. In June of 1864, after 2 years of naval warfare, the CSS Alabama docked at Cherbourg, France, seeking repairs for their ship. The news reached an American ship, the USS Kearsarge, who promptly left for France to sink the Alabama. You gotta think, the Alabama was wreaking havoc, and here it was seeking repairs in another country. Of course the Union were taking their chance. The Kearsarge was piloted by John Winslow, while the Alabama was captained by Raphael Semmes, who in turn challenged Winslow to a ship-on-ship duel, and the two obliged. So after 4 days of repairs, a French ironclad accompanied the Alabama to international waters, and the Kearsarge soon appeared, meaning the fight was on. At 10:50 in the morning on June 19, 1864, the American Civil War reached the shores of France. Both ships fired at each other and each landed shots, but it was clear the Alabama was not winning this one, because after an hour of fighting, the Alabama began to sink into the ocean. Semmes tried to turn his ship back to Cherbourg, but he wasn't making it. So his white flag was raised and Winslow took the surviving crew of the Alabama captive, while the most successful Confederate ship floated to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. After the states left the Union, Robert E. Lee was conflicted. He was a general for the United States Army, but he didn't know if he should stay and lead the Union Army or remain loyal to his own state of Virginia and lead them. As he sat in his property overlooking Washington, D.C., he decided. He and his family abandoned the place, knowing it would be seized insanely soon due to its proximity to the capital. They were right. On May 24, 1861, Robert's property was seized by a platoon led by Montgomery Meigs. Now with a massive property overlooking the capital in Union control, decisions began to come to fruition on its fate, and it was decided it should become a graveyard for soldiers. That way, if the Lees ever returned to it, they would see the effects of the Civil War in their front and backyards every day. The first body to be buried here was William Henry Chrisman. On May 13, 1864, a soldier who was only in the Union Army for 60 days before dying of measles. And if you haven't picked up on it yet, this is the origin of Arlington Cemetery, where all veterans of the United States Army are buried. What color are police uniforms? Well, before they became militarized, they looked like this, and this is because of the Civil War. Through the Civil War, the Union soldiers dressed in blue, and once the war was over, these surplus uniforms didn't really have a use, so they were converted into some of the first police uniforms, beginning in New York City and Los Angeles. Because of this, we now associate police with the color blue. The last state to be added to the 50 United States of America was Hawaii, on August 11, 1959. But we have a long history of that set of islands, spanning decades before this. So when the Confederacy broke away, Hawaii was interested in the conflict, declaring a state of neutrality. This was the island's official government policy, but some citizens felt otherwise. They wanted to get involved with both sides, but mostly join the Union effort, due to their fact they were against slavery, considering the practice was outlawed in the island chain in 1852. Both native Hawaiians and ones who have already moved to the continental states joined up. But we'll talk about a band of native Hawaiians who wanted to leave the island to go fight. Spencer's Invincibles. A few months before Hawaii declared neutrality, a man named Captain Thomas Spencer personally funded and trained a regiment of native Hawaiians to leave to join the fight. But after the king declared his neutrality, he forbid them from joining, fearing this would provoke a Confederate response. But just because Spencer's Invincibles didn't get to fight, didn't mean no Hawaiians got to fight, because at least 119 were documented to have participated in the Civil War. Draft dodging, a true American art form. If you don't know what the draft is, for some reason, it's basically a system in place that forces able-bodied civilians to go to war, and it was mostly used during the Vietnam War. In that war, people would injure themselves to the point of a physical disability, flee for Canada, or pay doctors to forge medical documents to make them ineligible to serve. But veterans in the Civil War had a simpler method to get out of mandatory service. In the Civil War draft, one of the requirements was for soldiers to have 4 front teeth, so they could rip the gunpowder patches so their guns could be loaded. So of course, to get out of the war, soldiers would just knock out all their teeth to avoid getting drafted. So once the southern states left the Union, we know West Virginia left Virginia to join back with the Union. But did you know another part of another state tried to do the same thing? Tennessee was the last state to leave the North, but not everyone was happy with this. and a singular county wanted to join the Union, Scott County. East Tennessee as a whole didn't have much slavery as the other sections, so it became more favorable to the Union. Following Tennessee's secession, Scott declared their own independence on June 12, 1861, 4 days after Tennessee seceded, and 8 days before West Virginia joined the Union. In response, Governor of Tennessee, Isham Harris, sent 1,700 people to capture the county, which resulted in a battle that the state of Scott won, pushing back the Confederate forces. Through the entire Civil War, Scott and East Tennessee as a whole served as an enclave, where pro-Union soldiers and refugees could live freely. Earlier, we discussed Andersonville, the Confederate POW camp made to house Union soldiers. So now, it's only fair we talk about the North's own prison. This camp originated as a training ground for Union soldiers, but was converted into a prison in April of 1864, and Elmira Prison was born. It faced the same issues Andersonville was facing, overcrowding. But before we get there, we have a problem with the prisoners getting there, because a train full of them crashed into another train, killing 66 people. But alright, the prisoners are here now. Now what? Well, nothing. They just kind of sat around all day. They weren't even given manual labor to do. Disease ran rampant through here, same as Andersonville, mostly caused from contaminated drinking water. Elmira also had a high death toll, at 3,000 out of 12,000 soldiers dying, right at a quarter of all occupants. Because of this, Elmira was nicknamed Hellmira by the captives. What do Ulysses Grant and Donald Trump have in common? I'll give you a second. Don't comment your answer, because by the time you do, I've already said it. They're the only presidents to be arrested. We're focusing on Grant. And you know what? Let's have another Pawn Stars quiz segment. What was Grant arrested for? That's right, he was arrested for speeding. 14 years before the first car was ever made. In 1872, Ulysses Grant was racing horses outside the White House on a very populated street, and an officer named William West pulled the president over and scolded him for setting a bad example. Could you imagine this happening nowadays? Some officer Joe Schmo pulls the presidential limo over and scolds Joe Biden for speeding down the street. Anyways, Grant apologized and said he wouldn't do it again, but this was a lie because he did the same thing the next day. This time, he and 6 of his friends were arrested. Grant was given a $20 fine, equivalent to $517 today. The following day, there was a court case and Grant did not show up, but did pay his fine. People were just making anything back then, weren't they? This contraption is the Wenham steam gun, another experimental Civil War prototype. This thing was to be powered by steam, where a disc is turned by the kinetic energy from water boiling, and when the disc is turned, that's basically like the trigger being pulled. The thing couldn't meet the force of a gunpowder-based weapon, even though it could fire pretty quickly. The thing was confiscated by Union forces and put on display in case it was needed. It became a frenzy in the media, but was never actually used in the Civil War, mostly being used like, ooh, look what we got, ooh. Earlier, we mentioned how Lincoln had plans to relocate newly freed African Americans to Liberia, but this wasn't the only idea he had in mind for relocation. In 1862, Senator Samuel Pomeroy of Kansas was tasked by President Lincoln to come up with a new plan for relocation, and he, along with the Secretary of the Interior, Caleb Smith, proposed Lincolnia. This would be a colony of the United States, which is in the modern-day Chiriquy province in Panama, where freed black men could be moved to, where in Lincoln's words, a better life could be lived. He invited a group of prominent African Americans to the White House to discuss said plan, where they were firmly against relocation to anywhere. It wasn't just them against it. The governments of Central America felt this was a threat against their own sovereignty, so the plan was canceled. Even though Mississippi was one of the states that left the Union, it didn't mean everyone was on board, same with every southern state. But Mississippi is our focus right now. One such Mississippian against the movement was Newton Knight. He initially enlisted with the Confederate Army, but when the Confederacy passed a law stating anyone who owned 20 slaves did not have to fight, this convinced Knight to leave, as he now viewed this as a poor man's war. He went AWOL, and when he made it home, he found the Confederates had taken his horses. Eventually, his unit was called into battle, but he refused to join, prompting his arrest. While in custody, his house was destroyed and he was tortured. He eventually broke out of prison and gathered a force of 125 men and began guerrilla-style attacks against the Southern forces, to the point where they were able to capture Jones County, Missouri, proclaiming it to be the Free State of Jones. Jefferson Davis knew about this and ordered the county to be recaptured, and it eventually was. But Newton Knight escaped capture once again. He managed to survive the entire war, before passing away in February of 1922. History is full of role models. People may look at icons who have catapulted civil rights further than ever thought possible. People may look toward leaders of nations who have inspired millions with their actions. Or some may turn to the many great generals of history, the ones who have guided their countries through the darkest periods. And all of these people are great choices, but I have my own icon in history I now call my hero, Samuel Curtis Upham, or as he called himself and rightfully so, Honest Sam. Sam was born in Montpelier, Vermont, one of the most boring cities in the Union. So he joined the Navy seeking adventures, where he served for 30 years before retiring. He then headed to California as a part of their gold rush, where he found nothing. So instead, he moved to Sacramento and began the city's first daily newspaper. But he got bored of this, and he sold his shares in the company before heading back home at the onset of the Civil War, where his true heroism begins. After the Fort Sumpter incident, Upham thought to himself, how can I make myself as rich as possible off this nationwide tragedy? So he began selling anti-Confederate, insanely patriotic items to the northern states. These consisted of President Davis's head cut out and put over a donkey, which made him insanely popular. But what really got Upham's name out there was his counterfeiting. Upham began producing counterfeits of Confederate money, selling them to Union civilians as mementos of the rebellion. But it wasn't just members of the Union buying these. Southern men heard of these bogus bills and began buying them too, considering they looked exactly like the real thing and were cheaper than face value. So think of it as me, a West Virginian, going into New York City and buying 50 West Virginian dollars for the price of one New York dollar. This was causing a stir on both sides of the war. The Union was scared that Upham would begin producing his own Union money. However, there was no legal recourse in arresting him, so he was just closely monitored. However, the Confederacy were about to pursue a less than legal method, murder. A bounty of $10,000 was put on Upham's head, but he didn't slow down production. In fact, he probably sped it up, and probably carried around a spare 20,000 Confederate dollars in case someone caught him. Upham produced so much money that it's estimated that 1.3% of total Confederate money was fake. He was never caught. He was never tried. He lived the rest of his life in peace and quiet before passing away in June of 1885. The P.S. Keystone State was built in 1848, and it served as a paddle steamer, sort of an early luxury cruise liner. It would soon enter the service of the Union Army. On November 8, 1861, the Keystone State left Detroit, Michigan, headed for Milwaukee. The cargo manifest stated it was full of farm machinery, but some people believe it was carrying gold and military supplies meant for the Union Army. No matter what was on board the ship, it never made it to its goal, as it actually sank a couple of days after leaving Detroit. The ship wasn't found until nearly 150 years later, when in 2013 it was discovered and it was empty. There was no farm machinery or gold on board. It's believed whatever cargo it was carrying was jettisoned before it crashed, trying to reduce its weight. On December 13, 1862, the Battle of Fredericksburg was about to begin. In 4 days, 1,300 Union and 600 Confederate soldiers would be dead. At the beginning of the conflict, one unit of Union soldiers were hit hard, over 8,000 casualties in total. Now a quick refresher, a casualty doesn't always mean a death, by the way. A casualty just means someone is indisposed and is now not able to fight. So they're most likely shot or they have a broken leg or anything like that. But anyways, 8,000 casualties were currently lying on a cold, muddy battlefield in agonizing pain, and the Confederate soldiers wanted to do something about it. Richard Rowland Kirkland was born in South Carolina, and he enlisted into the Confederate Army in 1861. It was now here at Fredericksburg. Kirkland approached his general, Joseph Kershaw, and asked if he could help the Union soldiers, to which he was denied. Kirkland didn't listen. He instead filled as many canteens as possible with water, getting blankets, clothes, whatever he could spare, and began to treat the wounded Union soldiers. He was scared the Union would fire at him, resulting in a fire back from the Confederates, surely ending in the death of him dying in the crossfire. But when it became evident what he was doing, no one fired a shot, allowing him to visit every wounded Union soldier to take care of them. This earned him the nickname the Angel of Mars Heights. 1 year later, he was participating in the Battle of Chickamauga, where he was shot. His final words were, "I'm done for. Save yourselves and tell my pa I died right." We've discussed a few times how the Civil War left the United States mainland, and we can begin the final tier with the last story of this sort. The time Confederates fought at Pompeii. Not Pompeii, the Roman city destroyed by a volcano. Pompeii, an island in Micronesia, a Pacific country made entirely of tiny, microscopic Pacific islands. So what the hell was the American Civil War doing here? Well, it ties back to the CSS Shenandoah we mentioned earlier, who was currently hunting Union whaling ships in the Pacific Ocean, and they learned there were 4 docked at the tiny island. So the Shenandoah approached and destroyed the ships, causing the Civil War to touch this tiny corner of the Pacific Ocean. We've talked about animals a handful of times throughout the Iceberg, or have we? I don't think we have, actually. But here's our last, or maybe our first, I forget. In 1861, a man named Daniel McCann bought an eagle off another man named Ogamowayazik. And that same year, a group of 5 purchased this eagle from Daniel for $2.50, and the eagle was nicknamed Old Abe by the group. They then became known as the Eagle Regiment, and Old Abe became their mascot. He participated in 37 battles, and was known to fly above the soldiers as they charged, screeching, giving the soldiers a confidence boost. Abe survived the war and became an icon across the nation. Unfortunately, he would pass away on March 26, 1881 from smoke inhalation. His body was kept on display for another 24 years before another fire permanently destroyed him. Today, he remains memorialized, as he's the mascot of the 101st Airborne Division and is the mascot of the high school close to where he was originally bought by the original Civil War soldiers. George Azerdaut was an accomplice of John Wilkes Booth. While Booth was targeting Lincoln, George was to target the vice president, Andrew Johnson. However, like we said, George instead got drunk and lost his nerve to kill him. Nonetheless, he was arrested for conspiracy and was executed. While in prison, George gave a statement which was recorded, but was never presented to the court, and it remained lost to history for 112 years, before in 1977, it was discovered in a courthouse in Washington, D.C. In the confession, George says he knew nothing about Lincoln's murder, and instead thought Booth was going to kidnap him, and he says nothing about his attempt on Andrew Johnson's life. Fort Monroe was a military base up until 1946, and during the Civil War, it housed President Jefferson Davis. He remained here for 2 years after the war, after being arrested for wrongful accusations of involvement with Lincoln's assassination. But some people believe he never left, as Fort Monroe is called one of the most haunted locations in America. Guests have reported seeing both the ghost of Davis and Abe Lincoln, along with other miscellaneous ghosts. Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, and spirits of animals have all been spotted here. Do you know who this is? This is the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. He's also one of 5 presidents to serve in the Civil War, and he should count himself lucky he made it through the Civil War, because he was wounded 5 times. Most of them were minor injuries, a knee injury there, his horse dying causing him to hit the ground there, but nothing really major, save for his first injury. During the Battle of South Mountain in 1862, Rutherford took a shot to his left arm, fracturing it. To stop the bleeding, he had one of his soldiers tie a handkerchief around it and continued his charge. This earned him respect across the battlefield, as he was regarded for his bravery throughout, helping him in his later political aspirations. When the Civil War came, citizens of all ages and backgrounds wanted to participate for their side, including an 80-year-old descendant of Pocahontas. This is not Curtis King, because there's no pictures of him, but I imagine he looked something like this. Curtis was from Chillicothe, Iowa, and was initially denied entrance to any regiment due to his advanced age. 80 is old, but back in the 1860s, you might as well have been a walking corpse, because the expectancy was 40, half of Curtis's age. Curtis was born in 1783, 7 years after America declared independence, and 6 years before George Washington's first term as president began. When he was born, the country was being ran under the Articles of Confederation. Anyways, he was eventually accepted into the 37th Iowa Infantry, nicknamed the Graybeards, because each man in the regiment was over 45, which once again was considered insanely old back then. He enlisted on November 9, 1862. Not much more is known of King specifically, but the Graybeards served through the entire war, and King would pass away in July of 1863, not long after he enlisted. As Civil War soldiers came to various hospitals across the state of New York, they would occasionally be treated by a young bearded man. That young bearded man was Walt Whitman, one of the most famous authors to live. When the war began, Walt's brother George enlisted with the 51st New York Infantry, where he was injured. Walt learned of this and traveled to see his brother. While inside the medical tent, he saw exactly what it meant to get treatment during the Civil War. He would write of this later. Outdoors, within 10 yards of the house, I saw a heap of amputated limbs. The house is quite crowded. All the wounds are pretty bad. Seeing this scene inspired him to volunteer as a nurse, helping out in the medical scene across Washington, D.C. and New York City. He later wrote about his time in the war, publishing his journal he kept in 1875. Later, he would of course game an initially laughed at career in poetry, but is remembered as one of the best today. When we think of the Union versus the Confederacy, we're concerned with this area of the United States, the blue being the Union and the red is the Confederates, with purple border states. But if we look over here, they weren't the only Union states. There's California and the other ones, so they're a part of the Union. Did they get involved with the Civil War? They very much did so. And like every state, there were people there loyal to the Union and sympathetic to the Confederates. While never gathering soldiers to fight, citizens left as individuals to go participate. But in 1861, a man named Sidney Johnson arrived in Richmond, Virginia, completing a journey from the west state of California, and he brought with him a militia, the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles. This consisted of a group of 85 men in total, and were assigned to help the fight in the furthest southern reaches of the Confederacy, mostly in Texas. As the Union soldiers were fighting their tireless fight at Gettysburg, a lack of morale began to sweep across the lines. They were dying in large numbers, and they were pretty sure this was going to end in a loss. Just as soon as they were ready to call it, they saw a ghostly apparition appear on horseback, speaking words of encouragement. At first, the men thought it was one of their Union generals, but as they looked at him more and more, they realized exactly who it was. George Washington. Here he was, the first president of the United States on horseback, encouraging the Union soldiers to fight back against the Confederates. This isn't the only time Washington's ghost was said to appear during the war. As previously, the Union were fighting against rioters in New York City, when Washington appeared and shouted the command, "Fix bayoneters, charge!" And when the father of your country tells you to do something, you oblige. With the bayonet charge, the riot was dispersed. I'm not even going to try and dispute any of this. It happened. I believe all of it. Yeah, sure, whatever. Washington appeared to the Union Army twice.
Hey, what's up guys? You might have noticed the channel has hit 100 subscribers. Now that number's not huge by any means. Some YouTubers go up hundreds or even thousands of subs per day, but it's a great first milestone.
Fun facts about every United States president. Part 1, George Washington. 15, Andrew Johnson. 46, Joseph Biden. As of May 28, 2021, I have now officially been making content on TikTok for 1 year, and it's been in 2 years. Today, May 28, 2022, marks my 2-year anniversary. I can't believe I'm saying this, but May 28, 2023 makes 3 years of me making content for TikTok. I can't thank my wonderful... Today, August 31st, 2024, makes 5 years since I began my journey into content creating. More specifically, it's been 5 years since I started my YouTube channel. I know it's a stereotypical thing to say, but I've wanted to be a YouTuber my entire life. As soon as I heard you could make money playing video games, I was hooked. And now I have it, although I'm not making gaming videos. That's besides the point. I'm a YouTuber. I'm living my dream. I am so incredibly thankful for these past 5 years on both TikTok and YouTube. And I'm so incredibly thankful for the wonderful audience I've accumulated across both platforms. I wish I could go back and tell myself on August 31st, 2019, you're gonna get somewhere with all of this. But I can't do that. But what I can do is tell myself now, on August 31st, 2024, you've gotten somewhere with this. Take it as far as you can go. There are 4 months left in this year, and I've got plenty of videos to put out in that time and for the next 5 years. So whether you are here for my modded Minecraft series, which, don't lie, I can see the view counts, my over 600 TikToks I've made, the Mysteries and Obscurities series, or if you've watched 10 seconds of a video, clicked off because you hated it, and gave me a second chance by watching this one all the way through, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and as always, thank you so much for watching.
And I think we've done well so far, but we'll continue to do well and continue to make episodes on this series because I'm quite enjoying it. I think the other guys are as well. And well, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching.